Hello again, everyone. It's me. Welcome back to the show. Well, we have all eyes on the conflict between Israel and Iran. And there's a lot going on right now. But I do like to draw your attention to one aspect that often gets overlooked when it comes to these kinds of conflicts. And that is the impact on the oil market. Now, when we see rising oil prices, what usually comes to mind are the OPEC Plus production cuts or the tensions in the Middle East. But this time around, things are different. This time, there is an elephant in the room, and that elephant is none other than the United States. The U.S. shale is restricting its own supply just as demand is going up. And with the Israel-Iran conflict heating up, it's looking very likely that the price of oil will go higher from here. In fact, oil has been on a steady uptrend since early September. And in today's video, I'd like to take a look at the latest development, how this conflict is affecting the oil markets and what this means for us moving forward. And now, let's get started. First, let's talk about how this conflict is affecting the oil markets. Now, the direct impact is really limited. Iran is not a major oil producer, neither is Israel. In fact, the total crude oil production for Iran is only about 3 million barrels per day, which accounts for less than 3% of global demand. So, the direct impact on global crude oil supplies is minimal. However, the indirect impact can be significant because of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you're not familiar with the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, let me bring you up to speed. The Strait of Hormuz is located between Iran and Oman, and it connects the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman. It is one of the world's most important oil choke points. In fact, more than 20 million barrels of crude oil pass through this strait every single day. That's equivalent to more than 20% of global demand. So, if something were to happen to this strait, oil prices would skyrocket. Now, the risk of closure is still low, but it's definitely elevated. And it's worth noting that even the threat of closure can be enough to send prices higher. And that brings us to the current conflict. Iran has threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz if Israel attacks Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, so far, they've only made verbal threats. But if Israel does attack Iran's nuclear facilities, then the strait could be closed. And that's a real game changer. For instance, during the first Gulf War, the Iraqi army set more than 700 oil wells on fire, and that led to a global oil crisis. In fact, it took more than a decade to bring the oil production back to normal level. And that was nothing compared to what Iran could do. If Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, we could see oil prices spike above $100 a barrel. We could even see a repeat of the 1970s oil crisis, where prices spiked above $150 a barrel. Now, obviously, this is a worst-case scenario. The chance of it happening is still quite low, but it's something we have to watch out for. No. The next thing I want to talk about is the impact of U.S. shale. Now, in the past, when oil prices were low, U.S. shale producers were the swing producers. They were able to ramp up production quickly and easily because their wells were already drilled and they had the infrastructure in place. However, this time around, things are different. U.S. shale companies are focused on rewarding their shareholders rather than growing production. They're basically sitting on a lot of oil and natural gas, and they're only producing enough to maintain their market share. For instance, the amount of oil produced by U.S. shale has remained flat for the past 3 months. And this is despite the fact that oil prices have risen by 25% since June. On top of that, U.S. shale executives have said that they do plan to increase production until oil prices reach $100 a barrel. And this is because they want to maximize profits. I mean, look at Chevron. Their profits have fallen by 45%, and that's due to lower oil prices. Now, imagine if oil prices were to drop below $80 a barrel. How much do you think Chevron's profits would fall by? Probably by 50% or maybe even 60%. And that U.S. shale companies are being so cautious because they do not want to repeat last year's mistakes. Now, this is bad news for us, because it means that the supply of oil is going to remain tight. Demand is going up, while supply is staying flat. And that's what's pushing oil prices higher. In fact, the CEO of Pioneer Press, one of the largest shale companies in the U.S., said this is the new normal for oil prices. He expects prices to remain high because of strong demand and tight supplies. And he's not the only one. The CEO of Equinor, which is Norway's state-owned energy company, also expects oil prices to stay high. And that's because of the underinvestment in the oil industry. Basically, there's a big gap between supply and demand, and it's unlikely to close anytime soon. And this is not good news for the global economy, because it means that inflation is not going away. In fact, oil prices account for a large portion of the overall inflation number. If oil prices keep going up, inflation is going to stay sticky. And that means central banks will have to keep interest rates higher for longer. Now, some of you might think that this is good news for oil companies. Oil companies are making a killing right now. Their profits are at record high. The truth is, they're not investing back into the business. Instead, they're giving the profits to shareholders and buying back their own stock. Take a look at Exxon, for instance. In the first half of this year, they earned $13 billion. Where do you think that money went? Well, $7.4 billion went to shareholders, and another $5 billion was used to buy back the stock. Only $1.8 billion was used to invest back into the business. Now, this is not good news for the long term, because it means that oil production is not going to increase over time. And that's why oil prices could stay high for a very long time. And this brings us to the third reason why oil prices are going to keep rising. And that is the increasing demand. Now, traditionally, oil demand rises during the summer months because people are driving more. But this time around, it's different. Global oil demand is expected to rise by 2.2 million barrels per day this year. And that's despite the economic slowdown. In fact, this growth is being driven entirely by China. China's oil demand is expected to rise by 3.2 million barrels per day. And that's due to their economic recovery. Now, China's economy is doing better than expected. Their GDP grew by 3.2% in the second quarter, which is faster than the 3% target. On top of that, China is still buying a lot of oil from Russia, which means they need to buy more oil from other sources as well. The problem is the rest of the world is not keeping up with China's demand. India's demand is expected to rise by 400,000 barrels per day, and the OECD is only expecting a small increase of 100,000 barrels per day. Basically, the world is relying on the US to pick up the slack, but the US is not able to do that. And in fact, the US is expected to see a decrease in demand of 100,000 barrels per day. And that's because of the economic slowdown. So, overall, demand is going up while supply is staying flat. And that's what's pushing oil prices higher. And with the Israel-Iran conflict heating up, oil prices could go even higher. Now, of course, the best way to protect yourself against rising oil prices is to invest in oil. Now, I'm not a financial advisor, so please do your own research. But personally, I'm buying some oil. And with that, thank you for watching. Everyone, stay safe.